it's pretty clear we're at like a very pivotal moment in how we build stuff on the web at all. The web started with like static files, and then, kind of like the web app architecture developed with like databases and web servers and, the security layers and so forth that like Netscape and others, did a lot of work in the 90s to develop. And that's just kind of been it for the last like 25 years. And what we've seen though is that there's been a huge shift from kind of the LAMP stack and like single server, monolithic architectures to sort of more serverless cloud managed services and functions, etc., that you're more like stitching together stuff from like a bunch of different like hosted services.
Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Linode makes cloud computing simple, affordable, and accessible. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale you need to take your ideas to the next level. We trust Linode because they keep it fast and they keep it simple. Check them out at linode.com/changelog. All right, welcome back, everyone. This is the Changelog, a podcast featuring the hackers, the leaders, and the innovators in the world of software. I'm Adam Stacoviak, editor-in-chief here at Changelog. On today's show, Gatsby creator Kyle Mathews joins the show. He's talking to Jerod about the launch of incremental builds, telling the story about this feature. It's 3 years in the making. They cover Kyle's vision for Gatsby, why incremental builds took so long, why it's not part of the open source tooling, and how he makes decisions between cloud and open source features.
I'm joined by Kyle Mathews from Gatsby. Kyle was on Founders Talk a couple years ago now, back in 2018. Of course, we covered Gatsby as well with Jason Lengstorf, also back in 2018. And we've had Gatsby on JS Party just recently. But we're here with Kyle, creator of Gatsby, to talk about what's been going on in this brand new thing, incremental build, which you just launched today, right? As we record this, the 22nd of April. Congrats, big launch day.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having me.
You bet. So before we get into all that, let's talk about launching stuff, because you just did it. Mm-hmm. What goes into a launch in your business and in your stress life, and how did it go today? Share me your feels.
Yeah. I mean, it's intense. I mean, there's just any big release, there's just a ton of work that goes into, getting it to this point. And incremental builds is by far the biggest thing we've launched in our company history. We've been working towards it for like 3.5 years, since I started designing Gatsby V1 back in 2016. Yeah, and like there's been like 4 or 5 engineers, working full time on it like the last like 6-8 months. And like we were doing a lot of kind of preparatory projects before that. And then, just like the marketing team, the DevRel team, et cetera, the sales team have been working on stuff, for weeks and months, preparing for it. So it's a lot of work. There's a lot of like, how are people going to respond? Is there something like glaringly wrong that we, is like that we're going to have to be scrambling to fix after it gets out? So you prepare as much as you can and you hope for the best. And you just kind of like cross your fingers and, close your eyes and step across the threshold and see what happens.
That's right. Hit publish.
Yeah.
So were there any fires in the last 24, 48 hours? Was there any blowback yet? It's just been a few hours out right now. So it's probably early reactions.
Yeah.
They seem positive from what I'm reading on Twitter.
Yeah.
But what about fires? Was there anything that went wrong, or marketing copy that needs to be changed? The little stuff that you forget about.
There was 2 typos, I think, in the blog post that somehow made it through the dozens of reviews we did.
It's funny how that works.
Yeah, no, yeah. I'm like, every time I'm like, wow, it's really good. And then I review it again the next day and I'm like, oh man, this is terrible still. But yeah, it was actually really kind of charming and nice that like the first OSS maintainer that we hired after we got funding, who was also like the OSS, engineering manager for a while. He left recently to, I don't know, relax. He's a pretty casual contractor engineer. So he's like, whoa, 2 years straight at a company. That's a long time. Anyways, he found the typo and like did a PR. And so all of us were like super excited to see that from him.
Nice.
But yeah, generally speaking, it's been pretty smooth. We've been testing it for a few months, with customers and like a lot of like test sites. So we were, we were pretty confident with things. And yeah, so far it's been smooth, which is great.
Very cool. Let's back out, zoom out, talk about Gatsby writ large, what it is, why it's interesting, why you founded a business around it, as well as an open source project. Of course, this has to be executive summary. You can do the full Founders Talk if you're interested, listeners. We'll link that in the show notes. But tell us, first of all, the Gatsby elevator pitch, and then we'll get into the executive summary of Gatsby Inc. and where we are.
Sure, yeah. Basically, it's pretty clear we're at like a very pivotal moment in how we build stuff on the web at all. It's like, the web started with like static files, and then, kind of like the web app architecture developed with like databases and web servers and, the security layers and so forth that like Netscape and others, did a lot of work in the 90s to develop. And that's just kind of been it for the last like 25 years. And what we've seen though is that, there's been a huge shift from kind of the LAMP stack and like single server, monolithic architectures to sort of more serverless cloud with like managed services and functions, etc., that you're more like stitching together stuff from like a bunch of different like hosted services.
Right.
If you look at a lot of other applications, a lot of people have kind of other areas of software. A lot of things have moved that direction. But like websites largely are still on CMSs. If you look at like WordPress is growing faster like right now than it ever has. It's like just like eating through the web. It's like growing 2-3% a year, something
like a third of sites now, isn't it? Or somewhere in that range.
Yeah. And it's adding like another percentage or two or something every year these days. It's just interesting to see that the web is still dominated by this old monolithic LAMP stack era kind of architecture.
Dynamic server rendered web pages, right?
Yeah, with caching and so forth. But everyone else has moved more towards like hosted cloud type stuff. So Gatsby is, we believe that's where websites should go too, because there's a ton of advantages towards using like managed services versus, kind of download and maintaining it yourself. It's just like way easier. It's a way lower effort to, scaffold and evolve and run software like this. And so Gatsby is an effort to take the web that direction. It's like, we like to say it's like, what would WordPress look like if it was invented in 2020? And for sure, it wouldn't look like it is now,
Well, we see WordPress even trying to morph to a certain degree with the headless style and WordPress API.
Yeah.
So even WordPress itself, which was around the turn of the century, right, 2000 era, is morphing in certain ways. And of course, it's going to be a hybrid, but it's going towards that and saying, well, you can use this way because people have seen the advantages that I'm sure you're about to enumerate. Yeah. And so we see older established players like WordPress offering these things. But if WordPress was invented today, or even back a few years ago when you started Gatsby, surely Matt would have made it different. He would have architected it quite different, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Like CMSs, because like traditional CMSs, they have like multiple concerns. They have sort of the content piece and the content management pieces, and they have like the presentation layer, how, the templates and database queries and the caching layers to actually serve the website. And so the world that Gatsby lives in, those two layers are split from each other. And so you still have the CMS. Like Gatsby works really great with WordPress. We hired two kind of WordPress veterans, including like the founder of WP GraphQL, to continue working on that and like build a really tight integration between Gatsby and WordPress. And so it's like, we're going to have like incremental build support for WordPress to do pretty soon. And, but yeah, and so in WordPress in the Gatsby world is just another potential backend source of data for driving your website.
So the advantages of Gatsby is all in the, well, not all, but the main win for static sites in general and for Jamstack and like this style architected sites is they're user-oriented, right? They live nearer to the user. They have already been compiled, so you're not asking your user to wait for that render. It's all out there. And that's really where Gatsby began to shine back when we had Jason on the show. I had an aha moment on that show because I had been reading Gatsby's marketing pages, and I'm coming from somebody who's been using, Jekyll and looking at all these things for years. And when I saw that Gatsby was like this blazing fast thing built with React and GraphQL, so I saw the React and the GraphQL, but also like Gatsby was blazing fast, which by the way, that's what everybody says their things are today. They're all blazing fast. So we need new marketing terms.
Yeah. We were there early, but now it's gotten a little saturated. So.
Oh yeah, I even wrote a skeptic's guide to developer marketing terms on changelog.com because there's so many that are just repeated ad nauseum. Anyways, it was supposed to be blazing fast. I was talking to Jason, and he kept talking about the Lighthouse scores and like all these things. And I was like, well, there's another one that's fast. It's Hugo. Hugo's really fast because, you hit compile or build and my Jekyll blog of 1,000-ish posts takes a minute and a half, and Hugo on that same content takes 4 seconds. And so that's how fast is Gatsby? And Jason was like, no. It's not fast there. It's fast. The produced thing, which arguably, and they're both important, but the most important place is where it's the fastest. And even back then, it was like, yeah, but what about my builds? Because I'm using it as a developer. And he was like, well, we're working on that. And so it's interesting that even back then, my aha moment was, okay, Gatsby isn't fast on the build, necessarily faster than any other players in the static site generator space. It's faster on the produced assets, and that's great. But when it comes to building, we still have this. It's not really a catch-22. Something to get a hurdle. We have a hurdle, which you guys have been working on. So explain why that's there. Why build times for these types of tools grows as your site grows.
Yeah. So as you're kind of alluded to, it's like pre-rendering or pre-building your site is an awesome kind of way to run a website because you don't have to worry about like kind of operating the website. It's like, a bunch of files sitting on a CDN can't go down because you don't have running code.
Right. You're de-risking it, right? You're not, there's nothing that can break in the request response lifecycle because there's no logic there. It's just like I'm serving assets.
Yeah, and you can't hack it because there's no code to like hack into. Like all of the actual running code is either on a CI server or like behind a firewall. Like the CMSs are well protected. Yeah, and it's like you can handle any sort of traffic spike because you're just on a shared CDN and they're seeing 1 million times your traffic, whatever your site gets, and the website is pushed all around the world. Like the CDNs take care of it. So there's a lot of cool stuff about the model. But yeah, the traditional kind of downside is the build time.
Right.
And in the blog post, the launch blog post today, we kind of went into like the history of these two pathways, where you have database-driven websites versus kind of pre-built, statically rendered websites. And this has been sort of the traditional dichotomy on the web. And it's interesting too, because like the early days of the web, everyone thought that like pre-building was going to win. And like if you look at like kind of movable type versus like WordPress, like that was the big battle in sort of the early, late 2000s. And people are like, yeah, movable type, like that just makes so much sense. It's like it's easy and scalable to host, it's faster, the websites are faster. But yeah, the problem that everyone ran into is that it's like the build times just sort of grew. So like you could like start out a project and it was fine, but then at some point your build times would be untenable and you'd have to like switch off to like WordPress or something like that. And WordPress made the bet that they're like, hey, with Moore's laws and other stuff like that, like WordPress is going to be fast enough that we can just rely on this sort of dynamic rendering model with caching. As history showed, it kind of proved out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what we've been working towards is, and like, when I went into like thinking about working on Gatsby full time and like making it a thing and raising money, et cetera, like we were very aware of this sort of dichotomy in that, database driven websites had won because they're much faster and easier to update.
Right.
But we saw that like there's just like another, option there, that it wasn't just like those two options. Because, before Gatsby, I worked a lot on kind of like streaming architectures, like stream processing and type stuff.
Okay.
Using Kafka and other tools like that. And these are kind of like new models that, kind of like in the big data world have replaced like the batch processing model. And so instead of, nightly or every hour running a process to kind of like regenerate a bunch of data, architectures like Kafka, they allow you to process data as it comes in. So it's like data is streaming through, and like through like some clever programming techniques, you can like update things very cheaply on the fly.
Gotcha.
And so that your kind of derived data is updated in real time. So my thought back then was like, okay, that could apply really well to websites, because like what is a website other than a sort of like the most recent view of a long series of events, so it's like code changes, data changes, et cetera, that get processed into something that's like served out to the users. So like static sites are kind of like the batch processing model, and then like database-driven sites are sort of the, generate on the fly, but like cache expensive things so that you're not overwhelming things, type sort of. So those are kind of like the two models on the web. I was like, well, why isn't there also kind of an opening for sort of a stream processing model, where instead of rebuilding the whole thing every so often, you just sort of develop a model to like very lightly update stuff on the fly, because then you get the benefits of it's like cached, it's like the view is up to date and cached, and it's like cheap to generate. But you also get the benefits of it's like real time. You're not like delayed by an hour or a day or whatever the arbitrary.
You're not batching.
Yeah, the arbitrary kind of batch update time is.
Right.
Yeah, so that's what incremental builds is. It's the idea is that you can kind of like blend the models of sort of dynamically generated websites, that are database driven, with the kind of pre-rendering, pre-build static delivery model. But you have a build process which is kind of patterned after this like stream processing ideas that can very quickly, very cheaply update the entire website every time like a new change event comes in. So it's like, we get a webhook from a CMS saying, hey, something changed. We take that, data and we figure out using Gatsby's sort of data engine, which pages need to be rebuilt. And we rebuild those like 5 pages or whatever it may be, and then push those out to the CDN. And that process, takes like seconds with the new incremental builds we launched.
How much time does your team spend building and maintaining internal tooling? I'm talking about those behind-the-scenes apps, the ones no one else sees. The S3 uploader you built last year for the marketing team, that quick Firebase admin panel that lets you monitor key KPIs, maybe even the tool your data science team hacked together so they could provide custom ad spend analytics. Now, these are tools you need, so you build them, and that makes sense. But the question is, could you have built them in less time, with less effort, and less overhead and maintenance required? And the answer to that question is yes. That's where Retool comes in. Rohan Chopra, engineering director at DoorDash, has this to say about Retool. Quote, "The tools we've been able to quickly build with Retool have allowed us to empower and scale our local operators, all while reducing the dependency on engineering," end quote. Now, the internal tooling process at DoorDash was bogged down with manual data entry, missed handoffs, and long turnaround times. And after integrating Retool, DoorDash was able to cut the engineering time required to build tools by a factor of 10x and eliminate the error-prone manual processes that plague their workflows. They were able to empower back-end engineers who wouldn't otherwise be able to build front ends from scratch. And these engineers were able to build fully functional apps in Retool in hours, not days or weeks. Your next step is to try it free at retool.com/changelog. Again, retool.com/changelog.
So incremental builds was really part of your vision all the way back when you started it. You mentioned that to the new stack, that like this has kind of been the vision. Perhaps even your early pitches to investors was like, look, I need to build this engine. Mm-hmm. The obvious question for me, somebody who's not having to build it, but somebody who'll just been waiting for it, is what's taken so long? Why is it so complicated?
That's a great question. Yeah, so this is definitely part of the vision from the get-go. What take it so long? Yeah, it's a super fair question. I mean, we certainly didn't anticipate it taking this long. I'd say it's like a couple things. Like, it is like a super hard technical problem, which, as we dove in deeper and deeper to the problem, it's just remarkable how many things can trip up fast builds. It's like, we just like kind of approach the problem with like different types of, source data and different types of pages, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just like been one problem after another.
Can you give us a peek into that world? Like, I can see, and I've solved technical problems, never anything that's taken multiple years. As I've dove into technical problems, I've seen the layers unpack, and like you turn a corner and here's a brand new thing you never considered. And actually it has implications for these 7 other things you thought you had in the can.
Yeah.
Can you give an example? I mean, I imagine the most straightforward problematic case of an incremental build, in my opinion, as a person who hasn't had to solve this problem, is I have all these pages, they have dependencies, right, of certain data. I update a footer, and it has to update these 75,000 pages or something. And so like knowing that all these pages share this footer data, But if I change this one topic tag, actually that's only 7 pages. Like the dependency graph, I can see where that's complicated, but what else is there? Is there other dragons that you have to defeat as you go down this pit?
Yeah, the dependency graph is the largest part because it's just making sure that, you can track the implication of every change.
Right.
And then identify the shortest amount of stuff that needs to be done. So like last summer, for example, an engineer spent like 2 months refactoring how we associate data with pages, because before that we were sort of like, there's some data that was just sort of like affecting most pages or all pages, which meant that any data change like made a trivial change to all pages, which of course breaks incremental builds, because you need to be able to say only change these 7 files. But that meant, that just sort of like baked in a whole bunch of different places. And so, kind of reversing that and like kind of getting the DAG clean, took a while. Also, it's like Gatsby builds do a ton of stuff. We source data from n number of places. It goes into this like data transformation pipeline. And so like Markdown is getting converted to HTML, and, images are getting processed, and, a variety of other kind of like possible transformations happen. And so we also are like taking the data that's generated from all these different like sourcing and transformation steps, and then generating a GraphQL schema. And then with that GraphQL schema, we then run queries. And so there's just like a lot of moving pieces. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest challenges that the team has faced like this last while is kind of like helping all these pieces like coordinate with each other, so that it's like a smooth deterministic process for like boink, 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 hits this and so forth. So one of the biggest ones we've done is we've been steadily moving more and more kind of Gatsby internals to X state, which, kind of like a state machine gives us a lot more predictability around coordinating all these different kind of moving parts. And so that's proved really helpful, both to just kind of like visualize what's going on.
Yeah.
Because, if you have like 7 different subsystems all talking to each other and kind of interacting with each other, it's like the X state visualizer is very helpful for that. But then also just sort of like lock down stuff. And so we had a bunch of kind of event emitter type things that were going on before. And so something would finish and be like, I'm done. And then 3 other things might do it. And so it's like you kind of get these like loops going where to like do it multiple times, or anyways, it's just a lot of inefficiencies and bugs and race conditions that would pop out of that. And a lot of that, didn't show up with regular builds. That was part of the problem too, is that all this stuff in a regular build, it's much more just like, boom, go through. Yeah. But then with incremental builds, you're now keeping the cache around. And so there's a lot of things that are already there. And so it's like all the random kind of like side effects that might be popping around that add extra time. Like they don't mean as much in the context of like a 5-minute build. Mm-hmm. But when you're trying to get, incremental build times like under 10 seconds or under 5 seconds.
Was that your threshold? Did you set out with a threshold of time?
Yeah.
And said, we got to maintain this threshold?
Yeah, 10 seconds from, content person pressing save in the CMS to it being live on the website is sort of our kind of gold standard for what we're doing.
So I ask you to zoom out again, because I think you and I might share some context that the listener might with regards to Gatsby's data engine, the GraphQL-based data engine, and how it allows you to slurp in data from all these different sources. I understand that. You sincerely understand that. Yeah. Maybe explain that so that everybody understands why some of these things that you're explaining may make more sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of going back to where I was mentioning earlier that websites are moving from a monolithic CMS to sort of like a distributed CMS, or we like to call it like a content mesh. That, previously, your front end was kind of like directly tied to your back end. So if you're writing PHP, or if you're working in like WordPress or Drupal, you have sort of like a built-in data access layer. You don't have to like do anything special. Like the data just shows up in your templates. But once you go distributed, the question is, well, how do you get the data from wherever it is to your website in the right format you want, into your templates, and then off to the user? And do that, consistently and quickly, and like it's not hard to set up. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so the solution that we've arrived at is this like idea of source plugins. And so that anything that has an API, you can write a source plugin for. And so I think there's like 400 plus source plugins now for Gatsby, which includes, all the normal kind of CMS suspects, but a lot of things that you wouldn't even really think of as like a CMS or sort of a source for data, but actually in practice turn out to be quite useful, like Airtable, Google Spreadsheets. A lot of like Greenhouse, for like application tracking systems is one of our most popular source plugins actually, because a lot of companies build their websites with Gatsby, and then they have a careers page, and then whenever they add a new job to it, it just automatically shows up on the careers page, and when they close the job, it disappears.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it's like it normalizes all these different data sources, and they could be a file system, it could be a database, it could be an API, it could be Airtable. Yeah. And as long as they have a source plugin, or you can write your own source plugin for whatever data source, Gatsby can slurp that up and use it on the other side.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We've seen larger sites that have, million plus like nodes is what we call it, like into each individual piece of data that comes in. And so tracking all that data and tracking like the dependency graph from like the data to pages gets to be pretty complicated. And that's where a lot of the engineering work has gone into, is making that all efficient and scalable and deterministic and, very, very fast.
So that does help understand why it has taken a significant amount of time. Probably your investors want to know, when is this going to be out there? How much?
You could ask us now.
How much do we have to spend to get this thing built? The other question that your users probably are wondering, and I've seen a few of them wonder on Twitter in reaction to this, and the question that I think plagues most businesses that have an open source project at their core or as a major component is, this is part of your cloud offering. This is a paid thing. This is not part of the open source project. What's up with that? And so were there technical reasons? I mean, the explanation to me, it seems like there probably are, but are there technical reasons why incremental builds is cloud-based, or are there only business reasons?
It's primarily technical. It's like, to make this work right, it requires like kind of tight coordination between the CI service and kind of distributed workers, because we parallelize a lot of work across like functions, plus like deploying to the CDNs. Like, to get, like the demo video that I put into the launch blog post in the tweet, it had me clicking in Contentful. It had a 3-second build, and then it's immediately, live on the internet. And that sort of like extreme kind of real-time build speed is only possible with very tight coordination and kind of like purpose-built infrastructure that is deliberately created around like the Gatsby build process.
Because the infrastructure is running the build. Yeah.
And so that infrastructure is, part and parcel, I guess, of our offering.
Right.
It's like purpose built for that, and is super valuable. But I mean, all the other kind of pieces, it's like, to do incremental builds, Gatsby has actually has been incremental in the sense that we like cache stuff between builds, so like if you have the cache there, it doesn't redo a lot of the work for, since V1, so for like the last like 3 years. But the problem is that most places that people do Gatsby builds, there's like hundreds of thousands of Gatsby sites, out there and running all sorts of different places. Yeah. The problem is that it's like CI services can, retain cache between builds, but it's often like an extra step. And then they don't do it very efficiently. Like most of them sort of like tar up your cache and like throw it off to S3 and then restore it. And so it's fine, it works. And like you can like easily achieve with Gatsby build speeds of, 45 seconds to 2 minutes, for many sites. But to get to 5 seconds, requires something deliberately built for Gatsby.
Gotcha.
And, when we raised money, we knew that this was possible, and we knew that no one else was going to build it, because like no one else there, most people that do CI stuff, it's like kind of generic services that are meant with a wide range of software. And we knew that it'd be really valuable for the web, that there's something like this that exists, that's kind of like, balances kind of dynamic nature of database-driven sites with kind of the ease of operation, security, and speed of static sites. And so we thought that this approach made a lot of sense. And make a lot of people happy.
So along the way, you have published some experimental optimizations in the open source package. It looks like this is like a flag you have to turn on. So is this what you're talking about when you say it does do incremental builds, or it does, maybe you call it smart builds? I don't know. It caches things it can in the CLI or in the build tool.
Yeah.
Is that what you're referring to, the experimental page build optimizations for incremental data changes?
Yeah, there was a PR that a community member did recently, and our OSS team worked with, it's a company that's doing like a larger Gatsby site, and so they were like, hey, let's like increase the build speed.
Yeah.
And so they added a PR to cache kind of like HTML builds. So that was like an example of, it's like, of all the things that Gatsby does in the build process, that was one of the things that wasn't being cached, and then with that, it reduces the amount of work. And that was awesome. And that's experimental right now behind a flag. We'll probably make that, the default in V3. But even before that, like we've cached a lot of the other parts. So for example, transformation of data. So like Markdown to HTML, for example, is fairly computationally expensive. And like image transformation is like, very computationally expensive.
For sure.
Running queries is kind of expensive, but like at scale, it gets expensive. And so those three things have always been cached. And so, when we launched Gatsby builds in January, we launched and we had benchmarks that show that, Gatsby builds was faster. This was like pre-incremental builds, but it was already faster by like 10, 20x over other services. And it was largely just because, we kept the cache around on disk so that you would get a container and would run your build, and the next time there's a build, it would just run it again right into the same container. So there was no waiting for the cache to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
It just started up, the cache was fully there, and because of that, it was just dramatically faster.
Which is just the difference between a purpose-built tool and a generic tool, right?
Yeah,
because on a generic CI, who's going to do your build for you, you get a container, it's going to do all the same things, only that container is probably going to go away between builds, or it doesn't know the Gatsby bits, or it's not aware of the Gatsby bits.
Exactly, yeah. And because, we maintain Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud, we can continue to do optimizations on both sides to, kind of get to that point where people consistently see, sub 10-second build times.
Yeah. So we had Frank Karlachek on the show a couple of months back. He's from Nextcloud. I'm not sure if you've heard of Nextcloud. But they started off as OwnCloud, which is a personal cloud software. And they were open core. OwnCloud was open core. And they ran into nonstop issues of determining what goes into the open source edition and what goes into the enterprise edition or whatever it was called. And they butted up against their community in many places because there was such an enthusiastic community, which I think Gatsby has as well, that their community would implement things and it would actually go against their own business model.
Yeah.
He actually started a brand new company called Nextcloud, which was he calls 100% open source, not open core. It's interesting with tools like these where you kind of have like an open source project. It's not open core, but it kind of is in a sense because you have a SaaS that's basically providing features on top of, or a build tool, which is kind of a SaaS. And so I'm wondering how often you run into these similar problems. Here's a situation where your community members built something cool, and it's like, hey, let's slurp that up and make that part of Gatsby. But have you struggled with decision making around where do we monetize? Where do we just give things away, and how do I strike that balance without alienating people or making my investors mad?
This is a classic problem in open source, for open source commercial companies, because open source is not cheap to create. We're spending $3+ million a year, paying engineers, designers, etc., to work on Gatsby. It's like a very complicated piece of software already, and it's just getting ever more complicated. Yeah, and we have investors who expect us to make money, and anyways, and we want to turn this into kind of a sustainable business that can keep investing more and more in Gatsby and in kind of the overall experience for building web applications and sites. So the model we've kind of arrived at is kind of called open cloud.
Okay.
And it's different than open core, because open core came from more the era where, the expectation was you download the software and run it on your own servers. And, with kind of the rise of more kind of cloud services type things, a lot of open source companies are kind of turning to a model where they kind of develop the capabilities of being the best in the world at running the open source software and kind of providing, various sort of cloud services around it that people need. And a really great example of this that not a lot of people think about is GitHub, because GitHub is a commercial open source company. It took Git, which is, phenomenal open source project,
right,
and then they added hosting. Like, they're super good at hosting very large Git repositories. You never even think about it. You just like Git push and pull, and it just, well, except for the outage yesterday and last week. Anyways, it's okay. I was going to say they're phenomenal, but, well, maybe not. Anyways, they're pretty good though, all the same. And they offered like the hosting, the infrastructure,
right,
because it's sort of annoying to like set up a VM or something and pop Git on it and like keep it secure and do backups and all the other crap that you have to do to run Git. And they added like collaboration, they invented the whole pull review cycle, which is like revolutionized how we do software. And I think that model of, providing infrastructure for open source and providing sort of like collaboration around the open source is kind of the model that balances, kind of like the freedom and hackability aspects of open source that people love with the need to create a sustainable business model. Because a cloud service is just not something that any user... Because the problem with open source is when the commercial entity has like similar ambitions and goals and capabilities as the user. Because then there's that conflict. Because like, well, why would I buy your silly little add-on when I can just write it myself? It's kind of silly. But in GitHub's case, do that many people really want to run their own Git server and like learn how to do backups and security and everything else? Like, there's some, but it's like an infinitesimally small percentage. And the same thing, it's like, does an agency that's like, building Gatsby sites, do they want to set up a Kubernetes cluster to run Gatsby builds and monitor it and all that jazz? Like, and there's a handful, but again, it's like an infinitesimally small percentage of that. And also it's just like by combining our deep expertise in Gatsby and sort of, the deep expertise and capabilities, we're gaining in like running cloud services, it's a very powerful combination that we can continue to kind of optimize both together and provide like a really, really superior service to people that are using Gatsby. Yeah, and then like the collaboration bits, it's like there's all sorts of stuff that we can do that like once we're tied into your kind of development and content workflows, there's a ton of things that we can do to make the experience phenomenal, not just for the developers, but the designers and content people and marketers, etc. And, that's the sort of thing that we think is a great balance for everyone, because Gatsby, the open source bits are 100% open source. We're not holding anything out of it. Right. But how we do the builds is kind of intimately tied into our cloud service and optimized so that everything is just humming along, like the connections to, like when you set up a CMS, we manage that for you so that it's like sending the right webhooks with the right, because like, a lot of these services, they'll let you like embed information into the webhooks. And so we do everything to like optimize what they send and how we pull the latest data so that we can so it's just like this big complicated chain of events that have to happen, to have really fast builds. And we optimize all that for you. And we develop a lot of, again, like sophistication and capability around that, which no individual developer of, working on a web project with Gatsby would ever do. And it's just sort of like, it's like we develop this capability and we can offer it at scale to anybody who wants to use Gatsby for a very reasonable price. And then anyone using Gatsby can like hack at it all they want and do whatever they want with it. We think that's like a really great balance for people.
I'm Jerod Santo, JS Party's producer and one of 9 regular voices you'll hear on the show. We are a party-themed podcast, so fun is at the heart of every episode. One way we keep things fun is by mixing it up and trying new things. We play games like JS Jeopardy.
This gives you access to an outer function scope from inside an inner function.
Oh, I think that... Never mind.
Global scope?
Incorrect, unfortunately.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
Debate hot topics like should websites work without JS?
I'm going to appeal to authority and read some quotes at this time. Okay.
I've lost complete control of this panel. Go ahead,
okay.
Ross.
The first quote, no code is faster than code.
Discuss and analyze the news.
This reminds me of when you're playing Pokemon and you have like, an electric Pokemon versus a water Pokemon and you try like an attack.
Share wisdom we've collected over the years.
To be honest, a lot of what we rely on is pretty garbage. And like, I mean, I wrote some of it, so it's okay. Like, I can say this.
Interview amazing devs like John Resig and Amelia Wattenberger, and a whole lot more. Oh, and did I mention we record the show live? We do. You can be part of the hijinks each and every Thursday at changelog.com/live. This is JS Party. Please listen to a recent episode that piques your interest and subscribe today. We'd love to have you with us. The GitHub comparison. I think what I'm learning over time as I talk to all these people who are in open source and in software and trying to figure out the balance and what works for them is it just is not a one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, because there's so much nuance. When you say open source even, it's like that doesn't even mean we all share the same license. Like that doesn't really mean much at all. And so you have to drill down and you have to say, well, this circumstance is actually slightly different because of the nature of their customers, and this one's different because of that. So I think that's just fascinating to talk to people like yourself who've figured out what's working for your open source project and your business and where to optimize for your customers and your users. GitHub's an interesting point. You mentioned they took Git and they added hosting. What's interesting about Gatsby is you've taken Gatsby and you've added building, but y'all aren't hosting.
Right.
Is that just for now? Is that because you don't want to run a CDN? I'm just curious. It seems like an obvious next step.
Yeah, we're definitely going to continue to tighten our integrations with CDNs. But what's interesting is like CDNs are phenomenally complicated to build and run. So most people who say they do hosting are actually outsourcing it to somebody else. Like Firebase even, doesn't do their own hosting. Like as far as I know, like Fastly is running their hosting. And like, the company formerly known as Zeit is using Cloudflare. Like Netlify is, I think, the only one that actually has their own CDN. But even then, I mean, they're relying on like a open source project like Traffic Server, I believe, out of Yahoo.
Sure, but from a customer perspective, the buck stops with Netlify, right?
Right, absolutely, yeah.
You're not going to go turn to their partners and say, hey, you're going to say, my website's down. And that's their problem. So they might be white labeling or, I mean, Heroku was built on AWS, right?
Yeah.
So a fair point. So you could do that. You could say, well, we've got a great partner. We can be on top of Netlify, or we can be on top of AWS and be Gatsby hosting without the complication.
Yeah. So our plans roughly are, we think that owning your own infrastructure and having control there is something that a lot of people want. So our goal is to have, just like we have, where like you can use any CMS and we treat them all kind of the same. Yeah. You can also deploy from Gatsby Cloud to any CDN. So right now we deploy to 5 different kind of deploy targets, what we call them. And there's like 3 more, I think, that's on our short list to add. And we think that's really important because, for a lot of teams, they already have something set up. They have contracts with the like CDNs, they have infrastructure in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud. And, the website is like an important part of that, but just part of that. So we want them to choose Gatsby, and we also want them to choose Gatsby Cloud, and we also want them to be able to continue running their infrastructure as they're used to. And so we can like push to an S3 bucket or whatever it is that they, that they want to do. But for kind of there is like a large percentage of people that just want us to handle it. So that is something that we're planning on doing in the future.
Gotcha.
But, as we just barely launched last November with Gatsby Cloud at all. And then Gatsby builds in January and now this. And so it's kind of one thing at a time.
Yeah. That makes sense as a not a priority, but I don't think it makes sense as a never do.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about the CMS side? So the other integration side would be, well, what about Gatsby CMS? Because now, maybe you can integrate better than, you can write your data sources better or whatever. Maybe you have great UX and you could offer that as an option alongside Contentful and the other CMSs out there.
That question comes up a ton. And I guess my most common response to that is like, which CMS would we build if we, built a CMS? Because there isn't a one size fits all like CMS. It's like, if you look at the CMS market, it's insanely fragmented. And the reason for that is that there's just like the idea of managing content and data
Yeah.
can go so many different directions. There's, Google Spreadsheet to Greenhouse, for job applications. And because like content, it's not just like the content, but it's like the workflows and permissions
Totally.
and everything around it that has to fit within the context of the team that's maintaining that content and data. So, so the question for us is always like, well, we don't have any particular expertise in that, and anything that we build would only fit for some subset of the market. And so our thought is, instead of building a quote unquote CMS, it's like we develop the capacity to kind of package together, Gatsby plus CMSs into something that's like, very kind of like feels like a coherent thing. The analogy I like to use is it's like CMSs were like mainframes, where back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, you'd have computer companies that would like build a computer from scratch. They would like develop a lot of the hardware, they'd write all the system software, they'd write all the user land software. It was just like this massive operation, and then they'd like ship you like, boom, here's your 1-ton computer. And they were super expensive, like hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, even in those years, dollars. And then the PC revolution happened, which was that IBM developed a spec for how these like different pieces could fit together. And then from that kind of like common spec for how the different modular pieces like talk to each other, there was just like hundreds of different PC, kind of SKUs that came out of that, aiming all the way from high-end business uses to, poor college student to, every other little niche in between.
Right.
And that idea of going from like monoliths to modular units that are packaged together is really appealing to us because, it's like, why develop a solution that just fits in some slice of the market where we can just take Gatsby plus whatever subset of CMSs makes sense for the use case of the company organization that needs a website, and then work with our partners, at the CMSs to kind of package things together really nicely. So that's like really streamlined to start new projects, to use it and manage it and so forth. And so we've already done quite a bit around kind of our preview workflows where, you'll have a CMS and then like they click preview and it like pops open a preview, like kind of a live preview of the Gatsby site on Gatsby Cloud. And then when they click save, it sends out the webhook and does the build. And so functionally from like someone living in the CMS, like they don't need to know that Gatsby exists. It's like, it's kind of like, if you use WordPress today, does a WordPress user really know how the site is like packaged and shipped, like the presentation layer part, like, do they really get what's going on? Like they largely don't, they're just like, they live inside the CMS, and then how those, the bits of information they're retaining gets on the internet and delivered to somebody is not of interest to them. And so like Gatsby, it's like, what we're doing with, WordPress, Drupal, all the headless CMSs, we're kind of acting in that same sort of capacity that we're fitting in and like so seamlessly that you don't even know what's happening. So like with WordPress, it's like we have experimental support for like, you click the preview button in WordPress and just pops open, a preview, but it's like now Gatsby Cloud preview instead of like the WordPress preview. And you click save and we can just show a little spinner or something until Gatsby Cloud reports back that now it's like live on the internet. So somebody could like swap out PHP, the PHP layer in WordPress, and just have Gatsby, and everyone living in WordPress, would never know the difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the marketing person, they think they use WordPress for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, and they do, yeah.
But then when they click preview, like with their site, they think it's on WordPress, but it's actually on Gatsby. It's on both.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just a different tool to kind of deliver it.
Well, you're definitely right that there's no one-size-fits-all CMS, and because publishing is such a personal or a localized workflow. We've built our own platform for podcasting for years because, we were on Tumblr, and then back when Tumblr was where you had to be, and then we were on WordPress. And yes, you can use WordPress for publishing podcasts. And yet it didn't fit into our workflow. It didn't work the way we wanted to work. And so as developers, we're like, well, we'll build our own platform, and now we can tweak and customize it to work the way that we work. Because even amongst podcasts, like our site's open source, people use it all the time to read and check out what an open source Elixir or Phoenix app looks like, but they don't use it to build their own podcasting platform because it's for changelog. Like it's open source because of course, but it's not a platform, a generic platform. It's a customized platform because we wanted customization. And so even amongst podcasters, you wouldn't find our CMS probably all that useful unless you're doing podcasts the way that we do podcasts. And so even amongst, you could say, well, we would do a podcast CMS. Yeah, you can hit the 80%, but it would be hard to hit the 80% in all these different areas, right? News, podcasting, e-commerce, etc. I mean, blogging or generic, a WordPress competitor would be the most obvious choice if you just say, what kind of CMS would we build? It'd be like, well, pages and posts and images, but what fun is that?
Yeah. But like WordPress and Ghost, like WordPress and Ghost already exist. So like.
Right. And what fun is it to have another one of those?
Yeah. I mean, there's like literally decades of effort going into making them awesome. So we're like, let's just keep using WordPress. Like, don't stop using WordPress. Just, swap out the front end so you don't have to worry about like hosting or security or updating plugins, et cetera, et cetera. Like you can worry about because like WordPress is like, everyone agrees the CMS is amazing, but the operation of the website and the development experience and the ease of pulling in other services and the ease of building sort of like application type stuff, everyone quite agrees that that's not so pleasant. Yeah, and I'd actually argue that like there's not enough CMSs, kind of like your experience. It's like there's a lot of value in building something specific to your needs. Like one of the coolest conversations I've had with a Gatsby user is it's like this little 2-person agency in the Netherlands. And they started using Gatsby with a really kind of like rudimentary CMS that they built for like political activist websites. So it's like a lot of like, political activism, a lot of like campaign websites, just kind of everything in that genre. And they built this like CMS that's like super specific to that kind of like world. And then they built a Gatsby theme that kind of encompasses, the maybe 5 different faces or something that these different websites can go. And he was just like almost like cackling on the website because he was like, I can build a site in like minutes because he just like, goes to Netlify and like tweaks some environment variables and like points at an instance of the CMS that he built and like voila, off it goes, And it wasn't hard at all for him to build that. And because like, because like when you kind of like decouple all the different aspects of the traditional CMS, like all of a sudden like building the admin part and the workflows in there becomes a much more approachable task because you're not worrying about like, well, how do we actually build the website and how do we like run it and deploy and all that? Because those are super complicated, but like Gatsby can handle that. And then you can just like plug in your data from whatever it is.
Yeah, you can have like a Cambrian explosion of small focused CMSs. Because all you're building out is the workflows that are custom to that particular vertical, and you can make it super for them, and you don't have to worry about the presentation layer, like all that stuff. Make a Gatsby plugin, source plugin, and you could have a separate team even working on the actual website and all that. That's interesting possibilities.
Yeah, so I see kind of a world where the average number of kind of content sources in a Gatsby site just keeps going up and up. Because like each team that's responsible for managing some part of the website, they can have something like very specific to their particular ways of managing the data. So it's like you have like a store locator, page on the site. And like there's a team that's maintaining that and like updating information about location and like, a new one's opening up. And so they're like, new store just opened and, geo-tracking, whatever. I mean, all the information that they need can be, locked down in like some CMS instance and they don't have to have access to anything else. They don't have to get distracted or, weirded out by like the 100 other content types, that other people need for managing other types of the website. And it can just be like super simple and straightforward to kind of do their jobs. Yeah, and I think that's like really nice because, if you talk to anybody who works on websites, most people do not enjoy it, And I think it's just there's just a lot of sort of incidental complexity that comes from kind of mashing everything together in one system. That doesn't need to be that way.
We're getting short on time, but I did want to ask you about Gatsby recipes before we call it a show. This is something, speaking of launches, man, you've been launching. You launched this one a couple of days ago, it seems like.
Yeah, just last Thursday, yeah.
passion project of yours, something you're interested in. Tell us about Gatsby recipes.
Yeah, so Gatsby Recipes is sort of like a new automation framework that we're adding to Gatsby. Basically, it can kind of take like a lot of routine tasks that you need to do with a website, and you can pull those things into a recipe. And a recipe is like an MDX file, which like maybe at first blush sounds really weird, but it's like Markdown and React components.
Okay.
And we wanted to kind of follow, yeah, it does, yeah. We wanted though to follow a kind of like a literate programming style thing, where you could like describe what you're doing and then the steps. Yeah, it's like tell the story through it, because we think that's really helpful for kind of like scaffolding, kind of code. Yeah. Because scaffolding is all about like, why is this website the way it is? It's like you chose different pieces for specific reasons. And so if you can say like, well, this is the recipe that sets up the CMS, and kind of like the components that like use the data from that CMS, then it's like, you can look at a site, like a site directory with like all these different files and config things and whatever, and then you could like pull it out, extract it into recipes that there's some sort of coherent story around that. So you can be like, here's my DevTools recipe, and it installs some NPM packages, it adds some dot files. Maybe it hooks up Cypress, Cypress Cloud, maybe like using Storybook, so it configures that, and it like hooks up to, kind of like cloud service for running that. Anyways, and so it just kind of combines all those things. But it's not just like telling the story, but it's like when you're starting a new project, you can reuse these recipes. And so you can just like, okay, for this project, we want WordPress, we want Shopify, we need our kind of a normal kind of like developer setup with like TypeScript and Cypress and Jest, and we're going to set up like Circle CI. We're going to use Gatsby Cloud, of course, to kind of do the CI/CD, and then we're going to like set up Fastly for hosting, and like Azure for functions. I don't know. You just like throwing together all these different things.
Right.
And then you can have like recipes for each of these, and at the start of the project, instead of like going to each one and like tediously kind of configuring it and like clicking new and grabbing API tokens, et cetera, you just like run the stack of recipes, and it's like, and like when it needs to know something, it'll just like ask you information, and then 5 minutes later you have a website. Because
that sounds cool. So I'm reading through some of the code as you talk,
and
even your select a recipe to run in the blog post, which will be in the show notes as well. And it looks almost like a Docker file, or like it's like a add this, add that, do this. It's almost script is another word that maybe I would use, but scripting has more connotations. Maybe this is more declarative than a script would be.
Yeah,
pretty cool. And so you run the recipe, set up. You can tweak it, and then you can just click off a new Gatsby site.
It takes a lot of inspiration from like infrastructure as a code projects like Terraform. Is kind of a prominent example of that. And because all these tools, started developing like 10-ish, 15 years ago. And the reason is because as developers started moving towards like cloud centric models, like all of a sudden managing all your infrastructure got a lot more complicated. And so they developed like programmatic ways of of maintaining and evolving that infrastructure. And so with websites moving to the cloud as well, the same problem is emerging. That's like, wow, like 3 CMSs, like a form handling API, and like this and that, and like functions. And anyways, it just gets a lot more difficult to scaffold out a new project and to kind of evolve it. You're like, okay, like we launched, cool, now we need to do this new feature. It's like, back to the kind of the setup stuff. And this is meant to kind of reduce that burden a lot. It's also another way, kind of another perspective is, kind of like the monolithic to distributed CMS and kind of the mainframe to PC. It's like when you go from a monolithic to modular architecture, the initial stages, there's just like a lot of energy that's unlocked, because previously people who are kind of locked into the monolith and like frustrated by the limitations, all of a sudden, like this kind of sophisticated early adopters, all of a sudden they can like start building out whatever they want. And they're just like super excited. It's like, a kid in a toy store sort of thing. It's like, well, I can do this and this and this. And they're just like piecing things together, and it's awesome. And that's like the initial stages. And that's like if you look at like kind of the homebrew computers in the late 70s, like they were buying like processors and, wiring things up. And like there's all these people that are super excited about it. But things don't go mainstream until you kind of like standardize stuff a bit. And then you can like package it together into sort of a consumer friendly thing. Because like, the average user of these things isn't as excited about like how things work under the hood. They just want something that, you press a button, it turns on, and it's, generally speaking, reliable and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, so it's like headless CMSs, headless WordPress, headless Drupal. A lot of people are really excited about this. A ton of people over the last few years, have built a lot of things. But if you look at like the percentage of kind of their adoption in the marketplace, it's like single digit, if that, of websites, It's like a very, very tiny. So there's a lot of noise, there's like, woohoo, it's like there's a lot of excitement and noise around it. But the actual usage is much smaller than that. So to us, the question, of course, is, well, how do we, mainstream this? Because we think it's awesome. It is amazing. It's like once you get there and you're building a Gatsby site, it's incredible. You're super productive. The websites are super fast. They're like really cheap and easy to run. Like that's awesome. But it's like, how do we get, lots and lots of people in that same world? And to get that, it's like it's packaging things up. Again, that people can just like, cool, like this is what I need to build a website. It's sort of like, the famous 5-minute install for WordPress, but for, kind of this modular world is our goal.
So Gatsby recipe. So this is part of the open source project, right? It's not it's not a Gatsby Cloud thing. It's right there in the CLI and available now.
Yeah.
And there's some recipes out. Is there a place for sharing recipes? Because that's the next step then is like,
yeah.
Get a recipe hub out there.
Yeah, that's something that's very much on our mind. Right now, people are just like, we have some official recipes that you can kind of get direct access to, and then people are just like sharing them on like Guest or something like that. But a kind of a recipe hub, like you're saying, we think would be super fun. Because our hope is that there's like tens of thousands of these recipes. Like anything you can imagine doing, you can just like search and like find a recipe for that, and you're like, oh, cool. And you can like look at like 5 different variants. It's like, oh, they set up this way, they set up this way, they set up this way, and then you can like remix it to kind of meet the specific needs of your project. And then like, agencies, companies can develop their own sort of set of recipes that they use to run stuff.
Very cool, Kyle. Well, congratulations on finishing your long road to incremental builds. You can go and relax now for a little while. Then you have to get back to work, I'm sure, as the buzz around the new stuff is out there. Of course, links to everything we mentioned are in the show notes for easy clicking. So definitely check out Gatsby recipes. Seems like a very cool new thing. Get out there, try it, share your recipes, and definitely give Gatsby a go if you haven't yet. It's got lots of interesting ideas at play: React, GraphQL, all the buzzwords, and Jamstack. It's the year of Jamstack.
Yeah, it's coming.
So thanks, Kyle, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jerod.
All right, sign up in the comments and share what you think about the Jamstack. Is it the future? Is it coming? Is it here? Are you using it? What do you think about incremental builds? What about the story Kyle shared? Is it inspiring to you? What are you building? Hop in the comments and let us know. Of course, you can comment on all our podcasts at changelog.com. Open your show notes and click discuss on Changelog News. We'd love to hear from you. One of the easiest ways you can support us is by telling your friends about this show. The easiest way for podcasts to gain new listeners is by hearing it word of mouth, not marketing, not anything else. So tell your friends, and we appreciate it. Special thanks to the Beat Freak, Breakmaster Cylinder for all of our beats. And of course, thank you to our awesome sponsors and partners who get it, Fastly, Linode, and Rollbar. And as you know, we have a master feed. This master feed brings you all of our podcasts in one single feed. It is by far the easiest way to listen to everything we ship. Head to changelog.com/master to subscribe or search for Changelog Master in your podcast app. You'll find us. Thanks for listening this week. We'll see you next week.